With, before we welcome our panel, and some of the panel are going to have to introduce themselves because they're not on the agenda. And for the risk of people who might have heard me speak last night, I'm just going to go over a couple of little anecdotes because the cannabis scene in Australia at the moment is very different to what it was back in the old days, you know, in the late 60s and early 70s. And I think that in many ways the new Legalise Cannabis movement started way back then, but they're quite different, or they were different in those days to what they are now. And I think it's worth looking at that and contemplating how they might have changed, because history's a good teacher in that way. Back in the late 60s, Australia's Prime Minister, John Gorton, a Liberal Prime Minister, was a patron of Normal, the National Organisation for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. And his Minister for Customs and Excise, Don Chipp, was a great advocate of legalising cannabis. Now, I mean, you just can't imagine that these days in the Liberal Party, can you? Like Tony Abbott and, you know, that fuckwit that's in there at the moment. I mean, can you imagine them being a patron of an organisation that wants to legalise cannabis? It's just, and that's how far the Liberal Party in many ways has drifted since those times. Back in those days, you know, there's a few oldies here I can see. The late 60s, early 70s, you couldn't really buy cannabis in bags back then. I mean, you could pretty much only buy red Lebanese hash and black Afghani hash that had a government stamp on it. And I remember being in the Northern Territory in the late 60s, 68, when it was being brought in on the soles of sandals, quite openly through Darwin Customs. You know, it was fine, but you couldn't really buy a lot of leaf in those days because people grew a bit in their backyard and stuff, but no one was really growing it commercially because they could bring it in from overseas quite easily as hash. In 1970, I was busted for growing 600 plants inside the Kosciuszko National Park, you know, that was one of the first big busts in Australia at that stage. 600 plants was a fairly sizable plantation, and the way in which it happened was, you know, pretty horrible, mainly because we had a head full of good LSD at the time we were busted, but more importantly was the way in which it happened. It was conducted by Robert Askin, the corrupt New South Wales Liberal Premier. His even more corrupt drug squad carried out the bust, and they were the mod squad, you know, two guys from Sydney, one who looked like Robert Plant, you know, the lead singer of Led Zeppelin, and the other one who looked like Roy Orbison, you know, slick back hair and Cuban heel boots. And after they disarmed us, I had a rifle with me at the stage, and handcuffed us, Robert Plant pulls out a roll of notes of, I don't know, $5,000, and says to me, now, you can spend the next 20 years in jail, or you can walk away from here today with a nice bank account. All you've got to do is tell me who you're growing with. Now, they clearly thought we were, you know, growing with the Griffith Mafia, which we weren't. We were just a couple of stoned hippies. In fact, we were working with the Vietnam moratorium movement at that stage, and the money that we'd hoped to raise from the 600 plants was going to go towards the anti-war effort, because it was in dire needs of funds in those days, and, you know, that was one way to get it, was grow a crop. Anyway, over the next few weeks and months in Cooma jail, I thought about this quite a lot, and I took a vow at that stage that you know, I would, for the rest of my life, wherever I could, advocate for legal cannabis, and you know, to stop this sort of rort that I could clearly see had started in those days. And to this day, it hasn't changed, has it? I mean, we're sitting here now watching police pull people over in cars out there. You know, yep. Did you go okay? Yes. Good. Thank you.
No, I didn't go okay. I didn't go okay.
Oh no. But you know, in that sense, not much has changed. You know, we're still battling this same kind of ignorance and whatnot, and many of the speakers at the other conference have said, so I'm not going to bore you with that. However, there is a real difference at the moment. You know, something has happened, and I suspect that it's the number of people who've been busted, who've been absolutely outraged, and who've taken a decision inside their own head that they're going to fight this. They're actually going to work politically towards changing the laws. And I think that there's a critical mass of people now who've been busted or who've been fucked over so badly by the government and by the police that it's actually now reaching a position where you know, people are actively being elected to Parliament on a basis of legalising cannabis, and we've seen this in Western Australia recently, which was a fabulous result. Very good. And we've seen other parties as well, like the Greens obviously have been doing it for a long time. The Reason Party, Fiona Patten's Reason Party, and there's a number of other parties as well. The Liberal Democrats, are out there doing their bit, mind you, Darren Lynch's party is not doing that. I might just throw that in there at this point. They are actually probably going to vote against Fiona's laws to change the driving laws in Victoria, which is a real disappointment when Darren Lynch came up here a few years ago and sort of walked the walk and talked the talk, and is now backing away from that at 100 miles an hour. So I think it's important to be aware of the political parties who are really genuine here, and those that are not. Animal Justice Party is another one who's right behind this as well. I must say, I was always going to suggest last night to David Shoebridge that that it's time to call a convention or a think tank of all the independent parties in Australia who support cannabis law reform very actively. And I think that the major parties will be quite surprised by how many politicians they get. I mean, there's a number of independents in the federal parliament who would come. The Animal Justice Party, the ones we've just gone through. It could be a sizable conference, and maybe we should think about that next year, Michael, something like that. So, anyway, I'm not going to bally on anymore. Yes?
Rob, can I jump in there and quickly ask you a question?
Yes.
Just very briefly, Darren Lynch is voting against the medical cannabis defence law?
No, well, the driving one.
Okay.
Yeah,
but you can still use medical cannabis as a defence?
Yes. Yeah. It looks like they'll vote against it when it comes before the Parliament. Look, they might have a change of heart, but at the moment that's not looking likely. They generally tend to vote with the Liberal opposition on almost everything these days. So it's hard to see them going away from this. And Stuart Grimley, who's one of their members, he's a nice guy, but he's an ex-police officer. And Tanya is a nice person, but she's married to a police officer. And you just sort of think, it just doesn't look good. And the messages that we're getting are that they're not going to do that. So anyway, we'll see.
You say police officers, I've set up grow teams in superintendent's offices. I haven't sold our grow room in the assistant commissioner's basement because I was treating his wife.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
What I'm saying is you say policemen, but beneath the facade they're also human beings.
Oh, exactly, yeah.
I'm sharing.
Yeah, but they're not going to support the more. So this is about people with legal cannabis being allowed to drive.
Yeah.
And it's trying to make that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh no, I'm not having a go at them. I mean, there are some good coppers out there. There's no doubt about that.
No, the point I'm making, they're also patients.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Patients.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
They need to be allowed to drive, don't they?
That's right. The patients have got to drive. They've got to get themselves to hospital, see a doctor. Whatever. I mean, you can't have a legalised cannabis, medicinal cannabis system that's supported by the state if they don't allow people to go and get the medicines. That's just crazy. But anyway, so look, without further ado, I'm going to start introducing people. I'm just going to go eeny, meeny, miny, mo and say, sorry, now, wait, yeah. Deb?
No, Suzanne.
Okay, Suzanne. Can you introduce yourself, Suzanne? Because the panel's changed a lot since what's on the thing here, and I'm just not across it. So.
Okay, I'm Suzette and I'm the Secretary of the Legalise Cannabis Queensland Party.
I just thought that the panel might open up with, we'll keep it to 5 minutes each, so don't go too long, and just, a general statement of what you're on about and what you hope to do, and we'll come back afterwards with questions, which is where we tease out the real stuff.
I helped start the membership for the party to get the party up and running because, frankly, I'm sick of being classed as a criminal for growing a plant that we all need, and it's helped and saved my life, saved many people that I know's life, and it's got a lot of potential to be prevention for a lot of illnesses. So my main focus is to get legalisation to grow our own at home and be able to assist ourselves, assist our families, assist our friends without prosecution and fear hanging over our heads that we're going to be arrested and chucked in jail. and that's my main focus for the party.
Right. Let's just go around that way, then we'll come back here. You're next.
Should I just that?
Yeah.
No?
Hi, this is loud. I'm Ben from Legalise Cannabis Victoria, and yeah, my main focus, I am a medical patient myself as well as recreational, and I find that it's very difficult to get my medicine cheaply. I can't get it cheaply at all through the legal, and what is legal doesn't work, so I have to go to the black market, I have to buy it, make my own oil, make my own this to do that, and it's just, yeah, it's just really hard to, it's just tiring. You've got to deal with shady people all the time, and you don't know what quality you're getting, have they put anything in it, you know, or have they used chemicals to grow it, all that sort of stuff. So I'm just going to pass it over now.
Good evening, I'm Rebecca. I'm from New South Wales. I'm on the committee, yes. And I'm both a patient, medical marijuana patient, and a lobbyist. Like, although I'm very, very new to Nimbin, and lovely town, by the way. But the support that I have been gaining with my cannabis usage, I've been very loud and proud and very vocal on how it is that we need to change as a country, not just states, and we need to stop bickering between ourselves and unite. That united front is going to push us to enable all of Australia to become legal at one time, regardless of the states and territories, because really this plant is from the earth. It is what we all have a right to have, regardless of what their little papers say and their signatures. We as a people deserve this, so let's legalise it. Join the movement. Vote. Vote number 1.
Got it. Okay, I'm Laura Barnard. I'm from Legalise Cannabis Queensland. I sat in on the first meeting after the Facebook post went out. I had no idea what I was walking into in that room. Quite frankly, that was an experience. And honestly, I just got caught in the undertow of everything. I went into the deep end real bad on it, but I've come out on top and I've learnt so much. I'm really inspired by these guys. I really want to help these guys get somewhere. Look at how long some of these guys have been here, you know, Michael and everyone, you know, it's been really cool meeting you all. So, hi.
Hi, my name's Emma Sinclair and I'm actually the odd one out on the panel. So I am from the Reason Party in Victoria. I'm the state manager and the national secretary. I'm really happy to be here with all of you guys, and I'm so happy that you're here. I think part of the campaign to legalise cannabis involves political parties working together, not against each other, and we're allies, right? So we want the same thing, we want the same outcomes. So let's join forces and let's do it as a group, not in an adversarial way. My motivation for drug law reform comes from a place, I work with a lot of at-risk women, a lot of women that have been, that live and work on the streets, that have been criminalised for drug use or have had their, and Sophia and I were sort of talking about this before, their lives really torn apart by a very early conviction and a very early incarceration. My personal, very passionate view is no one should be incarcerated unless they're engaging in activity that causes incredible community harm and there's intent behind it. If people are engaging in an activity that doesn't harm anyone, even if it harms themselves sometimes, if they're harming themselves, what they need is support and early intervention and mental health support. So the move to decriminalise a drug is sort of where I come to the drug law reform and cannabis law reform movement.
So, Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm from WA. I've recently been elected to the upper house there for the Legalise Cannabis Party. It's quite a fun surprise to have that happen in one's life, I have to say. I totally agree with that we need to cooperate across the states. So eventually, with the mainstreaming of the idea of legalising cannabis, so many people behind a movement, it doesn't necessarily matter who's possibly spearheading that movement, it's just about creating that momentum, normalising it, and eventually we'll reach a point where it will be legalised. I have no idea when that is necessarily going to be, but it will happen. I totally believe that. In the meantime, what we'll be doing in WA, closer? Oh, sorry. So in regards to WA, some of the strategies that we will be working on is impairment testing versus just the presence of THC, for instance. We're getting a lot of pushback where people think that if you use cannabis, you automatically going to end up in a shooting gallery in some dodgy place in New York somewhere. So we need to educate, take those negative stereotypes out of the common thinking as such, talk to people about how it's not addictive, how it's not the gateway drug, that trauma is the gateway drug, how we can support those traumatized people who are likely to develop addictive behavioural patterns or problem behaviours around that. So in WA specifically, our mental health care system has been gutted over the last few governments. I suspect it might be similar in other states as well. So supporting mental health care, making sure that we have sufficient detox facilities available for people using other drugs. I know too there's a lot of medical research going on around that. There's about 90 small clinical trials being run around the country on cannabis. One is in Bunbury in WA, we're known as the meth capital there. They measure that by the amount of metabolites in urine that comes out. And they're going to run a small trial, 20 participants, to see if cannabis used as a therapy can change the addictive behavioural patterns that they're in. But in the end, when you look at addictive behaviours, you always need to have mental health support around that. So the way we need to present that is to be really sensible in our approach, not too radical initially, because that's just going to get way too much feedback, but try to put all the little steps in place so that all concerns in regards to cannabis use have been addressed, and there's literally no reason why anyone can still say no to the legalisation of cannabis.
I've got two microphones. Sorry. It's Barry. Hi everybody, I'm Deb Lynch and I'm the Vice President of the Legalise Cannabis Queensland Party. I'm also helping young Angela over here in the front row to set up the South Australian Party as well. Most of the people here know my story, but I mean, I've got a terminal autoimmune disease. I'm also an amputee because of that disease, and cannabis was the only thing that gave me any quality of life. That was my beginnings in advocating for cannabis. Since then, I've also been arrested for growing and making my own medicine, so that's still going through the courts now, 4 years later. One day it will be over. But as you all heard this morning, I also got picked up yesterday for driving under the influence. So that's another battle that we have to, because it's just not right. It's just not right. You know, they're not testing for impairment, they're testing for presence, and Yeah, anyway. So that's one of the reasons why I am so passionate about getting cannabis legalised here. So, like Laura, I was at the library that day when we decided we were going to put our foot down and say, well, if these politicians aren't going to listen to us, we're just going to join their ranks.
That's right.
And that's where it started, and Queensland did quite well, even though we didn't get anyone elected. Queensland did quite well in the election. I think there were 8 of us who got over 4%, so we got some money back from the government, thank you very much. And then it went on to Western Australia, who were next, and actually got 2 people elected, so congratulations to Western Australia. I believe South Australia's next, aren't you?
Yeah,
March next year, and then is it Victoria? And when's...
Do it.
Okay, so we've got a little while before you two, but we really need people to sign up for the parties for New South Wales, Victoria.
Scan this code here and you can sign up in your state.
Yeah, because in New South Wales we need 750 members registered in order to, yeah.
For New South Wales, we need 750 registered members by October. So the more people we can get to scan our QR code or jump on the Legalise Cannabis Australia website or Instagram, Twitter, whatever, jump on those interwebs and join the movement, because the more members we get, the more of a voice we have. And your voice, make it count, because you guys are everything to us.
Do the police have a copy of the list of names that registered for that?
No.
Can they target our cars?
No.
If they don't let us know.
And all the paperwork goes straight
discrimination.
to the Electoral Commission, all of that.
The only people that hold those membership lists is the party.
Okay.
No one else gets access to those. End of story. Now, there are privacy laws that we have to abide by as well, so, yeah.
Do the police also have to abide by those laws? It seems like they feel their laws a lot of the time.
It does feel like that, but we're making sure that your privacy is protected, because you have a right and you have a choice. It's you who we're protecting, and in legalising cannabis, it is giving back our choices.
So I just want to get back to the title of our discussion tonight is the rise of the new political movements on cannabis. And I think one thing that everybody has to understand with getting elected to Parliament is that the voting systems that we use in Australia are changing, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for small parties like ours to get elected. In Western Australia, where we had 2 people elected, part of the reason for that was to get a good primary vote to kick you off. But after that, you've got to do your preferencing very carefully to wend yourself through the herds of sleeping elephants to get to the top. And that's what, we did in Western Australia with the help of a very experienced preference organiser who's been up here a few times, well known to some of the old stagers here. However, as part of that election, the daylight savings candidate was elected there on 20 votes?
98 votes.
98 votes. He got elected on 98 votes. He didn't even live in Western Australia, he lives in America. And then he says he might come back, if necessary or whatever. It's a sham. Oh, he's quarantined, yeah. It's a sham. And he was elected because the preference whisperer, Glenn Drury, who you might have heard about, who deals in conservative small parties and gets them elected, like shooters parties and things like that, he got this guy elected. He paid $50,000 for the privilege and he got him elected on a tiny vote. Now, in Western Australia there's general outrage about this, and the state government is probably likely to change the voting system now to make it more like the Senate voting system or New South Wales, where preferences don't mean as much. They still do mean something, but not as much. Now, it may also be that would leave Victoria as the only state in Australia that has a system where small parties can get elected if they do their preferencing correctly. But even then, there's no guarantee. I mean, that may evaporate at next year's Victorian election. We don't know. Now, what that means then for the rise of small parties, and especially pro-cannabis parties, is that I think there's a couple of the panellists have said we need to work in conjunction with other small parties so that your preferencing really counts. And you know, that's why I was disappointed that we didn't have someone from the Greens here today, because if I can say it, that's one thing the Greens need to learn, is how to preference with friends and not preference away from parties like the Animal Justice Party, the Reason Party and the Legalise Cannabis Party. The Greens seem to think of them as enemies, taking their votes away. And I suppose in one sense that may be true, although I don't think that's entirely true. And I think, you know, they need to learn that they need to vote with the people who support them, you know, and not with, you know, right-wing parties that might give them a slight advantage. That's why I called out the Derryn Hinch Party as well before, because, you know, they've sucked up cannabis vote before as well, and, you know, they may not vote the right way this time around. But there are a number of parties. There's the Liberal Democrats, there's, you know, the Legalise Cannabis Party, there's the Reason Party, the Animal Justice Party, even in Victoria, the Motorists Party, what do they call it? Rod Barton, Transport Matters Party. Now they might vote for this. They probably will actually, and they're the taxi drivers industry down there. You know, that's the party that they formed. So it's not impossible to win some of these parties over. I mean, we're probably never going to win the Shooters Party, you know, or some of those. But you know, we can have a go. But I just want to point this out, that if those good voting systems that allow small parties to be elected evaporate, then all the small parties that support cannabis are going to have to get together and preference each other very tightly. And if the Greens don't do it, it's going to leave a real hole in, you know, cannabis legislation. So it's worth talking to your local Greens people about that, I reckon. Anyway, let's take a few questions. It was a fascinating panel here. Many people using medicinal cannabis already. I think that's great. So, yeah.
Can I take a question from you?
To me, sure.
Yeah. You mentioned about the small parties getting their preferences in the hope that you can sort of slip something through or something. But it may not be a better long-term strategy. See, most of the small parties, everyone agrees with each other, like the Immunisation Party and the Cannabis Party. They're not at odds. Having some sort of collaborative opposition, like a coalition of oppositions,
yes.
Each one come into it, you've got to accept the person's key interest, whether it be legalised cannabis or stock, multiple organisations, or whatever it is, and actually function as a combination. Right? I mean, the little parties, I mean, they get someone in, it doesn't really much. Right? I mean, the little parties basically have to become a big party, like the size of the Greens used to be before they sort of sold their soul to companies. Right? I mean, that's the problem that you really raise.
Yes.
Like, they should be in this, but they wouldn't. So
yes.
maybe the only way forward is to actually hold this, to really unite and share their resources.
Yes.
Right? So that,
it's not a bad thing. Look, I mean, no, it's a good point. This gentleman's saying, you know, the small parties need to coalesce. Yeah, no, it's actually happening. The Reason Party, well, I might have been Emma.
So we're doing that in Victoria. So we recently formed a coalition with a lower house member. Her name is Ali Kappa, and she sits in the seat of Mildura. So there is a lot that we have in common, and you know, on 95% of the issues, we would agree. There are some issues where we don't agree, and so we still have allowed, as part of that coalition, there to be essentially a conscious vote on every vote. And I think Reason as a party would be looking, even when we have multiple members elected, we want to allow the opportunity for every vote to be a conscious vote. So not to be dictated by the party, to have members be able to vote based on what's right for their electorate, because what's right in the city is sometimes not right for country. So yeah, we are doing that, starting to do it as part of doing politics differently.
Yeah, so Legalise Cannabis, in the end we ended up with over 26,000 actual votes, by the way. So we did catch some flack for the preferential voting system, but a large group of those votes came from Green voters in the southwest. So they'd been voting Green for years and years, obviously. And they went from 4 MPs down to 1 in the upper house. And we captured that vote. So we didn't have a lot of time, by the way, to do so. So it was really the name Legalise Cannabis that people actually voted for in the end. I suspect because the Greens have had that in their manifesto for a long time, but haven't actually done anything with that. So I think that sort of pushed people towards us.
Another comment on your second point around, your second point around a small party not being able to achieve much. I don't necessarily think that's true.
I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah.
A large party can achieve more.
Absolutely, but you can achieve a lot if you're willing to work with government as well, or willing to work with the opposition, and so it's about building relationships and not attacking people who you might rely for a vote on later on, which is how some other political parties engage, rather than, reviewing each piece of legislation on its merit.
I just wanted to say that there are some other precedents here. When we were the Sex Party, we worked with the Rock and Roll Party in Victoria in the 2014 election.
Oh, of course you did.
Yeah, it was sex, drugs and rock and roll. But in fact, it was the Rock and Roll Party who got 1% of the vote and then passed on to us that enabled Fiona Patten to get elected. I mean, without that rock and roll vote, we would not have got elected. So it was very important. But we campaigned with them. It was,
They had policies or just playbacks?
They had both. No, it was actually the Rock and Roll Party were established by, who's that bloke that... No, it wasn't Tex Perkins. It was the guy that did that song with Kimbra from New Zealand. You know, that girl with the...
Gautier.
Yeah, Gautier. Yeah, it was him. It's his rock and roll band that formed that party. And then we joined with them and we went and did it. They got a big bus and Fiona and Gautier, would get on the back of the bus and talk to people at shopping centres and everything. But even after that, we worked with the Voluntary Euthanasia Party in Victoria and, shared a budget and did that. It's very interesting because this doesn't happen in politics, mostly. You just don't see parties. They're just so terrified of allowing someone to come into their tent, that they're going to steal their secrets or steal their votes or something. And it's just bullshit, it's the way to go. And I think, people who use cannabis can understand that really well. They understand what it's like to kind of work with someone in that way. And so hopefully we'll get a good response here, Okay, another question? Do I see any more? No? No.
There's more a comment, I suppose. Right? I mean, law reform's hard road and hard long road. Right? In the meantime, people are being arrested, patients, especially homegrown patients, being arrested because of the 20-day limit. They're actually being incarcerated. Our current strategy for immediate intervention is what we call warfare. Right? Warfare by law.
Yes.
So we're encouraging people who've been charged with indictment quantities to plead not guilty and use a medical necessity defence. What we've done is simplify the medical necessity defence into 3 elements which they have to establish. And they're relatively easy to cannabis with people who are really sick. I mean, unfortunately this applies to New South Wales, not to Queensland. Or we could have done a lot better if we did. But in New South Wales you just have to satisfy 3 elements. Right? That the otherwise illegal act was done to prevent serious injury or harm. What's that? Can no one hear? Oh, right, okay. Yeah. No, look, the 3 elements, and it's relatively easy for cannabis patients, like especially epilepsy and things like that. First one, the otherwise illegal act has to be done to prevent serious injury or harm. Pretty easy, right? There has to be no reasonable alternative. Pretty easy with the allopathic drug failures, right? And the third one is the otherwise illegal act has to be in proportion to the benefit gained. Pretty easy, right? When you spell that out to a jury, right, and they're the elements of the law, the jury will acquit, right? What we're hoping to do this year is run 2 medical necessity defences, and after that and on the back of those, run more. And I think I hope even the New South Wales Police will one day stop busting medical grows. That's the hope, to hurry it up a bit. All right, but a medical necessity defence has been established in New South Wales and we should use it as a fairly powerful tool to pressure at the cold front the cops to stop doing it. Right? They usually don't like to lose court cases. And if we can get 3 or 4 in a row, I think there might be a change of behaviour.
Okay, we'll take that as a comment.
What you're talking about is really similar to, I guess, how abortion law changed. There was a precedent that happened in court, that stopped doctors being criminalised and the women being criminalised for seeking an abortion service, and then the states changed. So it's I guess a similar approach. If you can get a precedent in a court and then rely on that in later, yeah.
Great. Can you shout, or do you want to use it? I think everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you all for being here and for all the work you're doing. I've been personally shocked at the number of professional police men and women that are posted outside this town this weekend. And I'd like to understand, is there a way to ask members of parliament, in a climate this year when many women have been outraged by some of the stories and the perhaps lack of policing done in those kinds of areas of domestic violence or personal violence against women that have come out in the media, how is it that they can justify this expenditure around this really, frankly, tiny town with what appears to be a political protest to me going on? Are we able to ask them to justify their expenditure as a method to, once again, start to change some of this focusing? And it seems to me domestic violence is such a worse thing in society than certain people using a herb or a medicine, and even without a prescription, dare they do that? And are we able to call the police account for the way they spend their money? Is that an option? What can be done?
Would I be right in saying yes? Yes. So I love everything you just said. Thank you. That's one of the big reasons I stood, because I went through domestic violence and I shouldn't be here. But I am, because I played their game. So I would very much like to work on you with that if you're happy to.
Yes, it's very close to my experience.
Yeah.
And passionate about it.
Thank you.
Emma and I were discussing this just before we walked in here, basically. We've agreed that the actions were over the top and it seemed petty and childish.
And it's all single-use plastic. Isn't that illegal now in some states?
It's, yeah.
What's going on there?
You know,
It's like you were at the table.
when you look at people being stoned, they're happy. They're not fighting. There's no aggression. So for the police to be here, they can't use aggression as an excuse for that. So the only logical conclusion that we came to was that it was intimidation and possibly trying to provoke people into being somehow nasty towards the police, and that then can be used against us. That was our conclusion.
It certainly felt intimidating to me. Yeah. And I felt like maybe it's not safe to come because of all these police people, and who knows what they'll find in my saliva. I don't know. I bought food that was cooked by someone who knows what, you know. Some people are saying that if you kiss someone, it could be on your saliva. So no more kissing. And, you know, all these things are getting out. Another thing that I'd love to just say is that I've been living in Italy these last 10 years or so, and if you go into a grow shop there, you choose from a seed catalogue. It's clearly labelled what kind of seed, how long it takes to grow outside or inside, what kinds of other elements to the plant, the structure, its family parentage and the genetic structure, and it clearly labels what specific medicinal effect this particular plant is likely to help you with. So you can then, as an adult, with your own intellect, choose what kinds of medical issues you might be trying to address. There's no stigma about it. You are limited to the number of plants that you can grow in your own home and whatnot, but the knowledge is out there. So this gentleman who said about he doesn't want to grow with chemicals and he'd like to know which strain he's smoking, and sometimes he doesn't want to talk to a criminal so he can have medicine. Like, man, there are other people living that reality right now. Why are we not? Thank you.
Please use the mic for questions so we can all hear. We're on a live broadcast, so the world is listening but not watching.
Just to answer your question a bit about what could we do, like as the politician here, and I guess as my partner. I mean, I know it sounds funny, but you know, you've got to start at the bottom in a way. I mean, this is sort of like a broad-based knowledge exercise in many ways. You know, so the first thing you can do, I don't know, go to the local community radio station and say, this is fucked. You know, and can I do a program, or can I help someone do a program on this there, and work on that, and then, you know, next week ring Ray Hadley on 2GB and say, you know, this is fucked. You know, I want to, got to get anywhere, but you know what I mean. Work on it that way. But you can also petition members of Parliament as well, and that's another thing. I mean, just ring their office and make a complaint, or write to them.
That message, just speak up, however you speak.
Exactly. Just speak up. Exactly. Oh, that's right. You know, it's true. And I think most people probably go home from Mardi Gras and think, oh yeah, well, you know, okay, I've heard this and I've heard that, and I'm much better informed and I've had a great time, but I'm not going to do anything. You know, it's too difficult for me, or I don't know how, or whatever. But it's a matter of just going to, you know, the nearest person you know who's in media and calling them and saying, can we do something on here? Your local member of Parliament is always accessible, and like if they get one or two complaints about Nimbin, it's probably not going to make them do anything. But if they get a dozen, it puts it in their awareness, you know, and that's just the way things increase. And I mean, the reason Sophia was elected in that way was because people had heard, you know, about cannabis inconsistencies and, you know, horrible things, and that's one of the reasons she gets voted. So, yeah, so I'd encourage everyone to just, you know, think it through a bit and try and do something. That's if everyone from Mardi Gras went away and did that, even wrote a letter to a local member of Parliament in New South Wales about it, you know, that's going to be, how many letters would that be, Michael?
About what specifically?
Well, just
write a letter. What about?
About what this lady here was saying, that, you know, men are raping women in Parliament and, you know, fucking jacking off on their tables and all this sort of stuff, and yet the government finds the funds to go and put police on the highway here rather than clean up their act in their Parliament. You know.
It's about the police presence for Mardi Gras. Well, that's the first story. At the moment, just talking about this business of the police concentrating so much effort, energy and money on this little festival we're having here.
It's not just the little festival though, love. I don't know about the statistics in New South Wales because I'm from Queensland, but I know in Queensland the police operating budget is $1 billion a year. Over 500 million of that is spent on drug enforcement. More than half their police operating budget in Queensland is used on drug enforcement. Now, they have no statistics, no breakdowns of which drugs. They don't keep those numbers. But we've made those inquiries, and we've made federal inquiries as well. 92% of the people who are being arrested are end users, patients, carers and personal users. And all of those Drugs Misuse Acts were set up to catch traffickers, not personal users.
Can I just say something about talking to politicians too, I reckon? Sophie, you're going to join this world, and they live in a surreal world, you know. They're super busy, it's all plush carpets, no one's getting muddy feet anymore. And I think that, you know, making an appointment, you make an appointment with politicians, you go and see them, and you tell them your story. You know, you use cannabis for this reason, this is what it does, the drug driving laws are enough. They just need educating. So the biggest lobbying force in politics, I think, is the pharmaceutical industry. They spend a lot of money, full on, to maintain, you know, cannabis especially being illegal. They're going to lose a lot of money. So I figure, my logic, the more we can talk to other politicians and hear our stories, which they don't hear, they don't come across. They live in another world a bit. There's lots of money there, a few people can afford legal cannabis, It's too expensive for us, and the driving thing's too big, too much for most people. So I just want to educate them, politicians, really. And a personal meeting with them does heaps. And sure, while you're there, you say, I went to Mardigrass, mate. They spent like $250,000 on policing, and the organisers only spent 50 grand. That's what's going on.
Can I just quickly comment on the annual cost of Australia? So one of the things, we've got a parliamentary inquiry into the use of cannabis happening in Victoria at the moment, which is really exciting. If you want to go in and have a look at the some of the testimonies on the website, I'd encourage you to do that. But one of the figures that really stuck in my mind, so we spend $2.5 billion policing cannabis in Australia annually. $2.5 billion every year, and $1.1 billion of that is spent on incarceration for people that should never be in jail in the first place. It is absolutely appalling.
Hello. There was an instance in my younger days. I was in Castlemaine, moved there, town of 7,000 in Victoria, and they said that when the hippies turned up with all the marijuana, the fighting on Friday night at the pub ceased. So that's the male hierarchy settled a bit.
Well, I think we saw that at the year 2000 celebrations in Sydney, didn't we? When everyone was taking ecstasy and smoking dope around the harbour. And I think there was one assault charge in the whole night, you know, and the police couldn't...
Rob, I have a comment that I just want to throw in, because it upsets me and it grieves me. Each state seems to allow different medical defences, different defences for a zero tolerance test. For example, Queensland, they have removed the honest and reasonable defence, and the medical cannabis defence doesn't exist. And yet it's popping up now in Victoria that you might have a medical cannabis defence, and in New South Wales an honest and reasonable defence of mistake of fact. So it aggrieves me that there are such injustices that you are not unable to defend yourself state to state. I don't know. Throw that out there.
Yeah, well, that's true, but I mean, that's the federation that we live in, I guess, isn't it? I mean, it's always been that way. I mean, there have been arguments over rail gauges for 120 years in Australia. They still can't get the same fucking rail gauge. So it's a difficult issue, and I mean, really the federal government should take hold of this and you know, and make uniform laws around Australia. But I think that's way off. And I mean,
conquer and divide. Is that
conquer
what
and
they're
divide.
doing?
Yeah, exactly. Although the other way can still work. You know, like as we were saying last night, that if Victoria is successful in changing the drug driving laws down there to allow people with a legal, you know, medicinal cannabis script to drive, that'll be the thin end of the wedge. And that would go around Australia, we think, fairly quickly. So,
and here's, I'm going to throw another thing in the mix for you. If I legally have an honest and reasonable mistake of defence because I accidentally got infected by cannabis at New South Wales Mardigrass, but detected in Queensland, so I've broken that law there, surely the crime occurred in New South Wales. I don't know. I mean, can I then argue?
The crime is to have the drug in your system. So it's not where you ingested it, it's that it's in your system.
It seems wrong that I may have ingested it in New South Wales.
Oh, everything wrong.
Turn your button on if it's off.
Oh, there we go, sorry. So, because we're all here, we're a united front. We want all of Australia to be a united front. Tear down the borders. We're all the same. It doesn't matter who or like what gender. It doesn't matter whether you're a woman. It doesn't matter if you like wearing big hats or small hats. We're all human. We are all one. If we stand united, we can win. There's no WA, there's no New South Wales, there's no Victoria. We are Australia. We are Australians. It doesn't matter if we're Hispanic Australians. It doesn't matter if we're Asian Australians. We are Australia. We live in this beautiful country. Stop fighting amongst yourselves and stand up for what is right.
Mike.
I just want to reiterate what Michael said before about approaching politicians personally. It is the best way. Everybody knows that if you, if someone comes to see you personally and puts a personal story to you, you're going to remember